Abuja International Conference Center, Nigeria. It was a day unlike any other. Under the scorching West African sun, motorcades pulled into the majestic grounds of the Abuja International Conference Center. Security was tighter than usual, the media presence heavier. A sea of delegates, aides, journalists, and military escorts moved through the colossal glass entrance. The scent of high-stakes diplomacy clung to the air like perfume in a royal chamber. Inside, the grand hall buzzed with anticipation. Flags from 23 African nations draped the walls like colored tapestries. The summit, officially titled the African Renaissance Dialogue, had been planned months in advance, designed to address the continent's escalating economic disparity, political instability, and security threats. But as the day unfolded, it became clear that something deeper was brewing beneath the surface. At the center of it all stood the aging lion of African politics, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu of Nigeria. Dressed in a regal agbada embroidered with golden patterns, he moved through the hall like a monarch surveying his domain. A master tactician and longtime power broker, Tinubu had spent decades crafting his image as Africa's elder statesman. Many leaders owed him favors, others feared his shrewdness. Cameras flashed as he offered rehearsed smiles and confident waves. Yet, for all the usual pomp and pageantry, whispers swirled around one name, a name that carried weight far beyond its syllables: Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso. No one had expected him to come. Burkina Faso's inclusion in the summit had been hotly debated behind closed doors. Since Traoré seized power, relations with ECOWAS and Nigeria had soured. Western diplomats painted him as a dangerous populist. His expulsion of French troops and defiant tone made him both a pariah and a folk hero. But the African youth adored him. He had become a symbol of resistance, of rebirth, of defiance. When word came that Traoré would attend in person, it was as if a match had been lit in a room filled with gas. Inside the conference chamber, his presence was undeniable. Though younger and less extravagantly dressed than the others, Traoré's military jacket and sharp gaze made him stand out like a blade in a room full of velvet. Some senior leaders shot him cautious glances. Others ignored him. But the younger ministers, aides, and media professionals couldn't take their eyes off him. He sat quietly, alone, surrounded by his small Burkinabe delegation, his posture relaxed but alert. He said little, yet his silence spoke volumes. As the opening ceremony began, a string quartet played a blend of African hymns and classical symphonies. Dancers performed symbolic routines meant to evoke unity, progress, and shared destiny. The ceremony, though beautiful, felt strangely hollow. Everyone was waiting for the real theater to begin, the speeches. When Tinubu rose to deliver the opening address, the hall fell into a reverent hush. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his deep voice resonating through the marble columns, "Africa stands at a crossroads. Our continent is rich not only in minerals but in wisdom, and today we must draw on that wisdom to confront our challenges." The applause was polite, rhythmic. The speech was expertly crafted. Tinubu spoke of unity, trade, African-led solutions, and regional stability. But midway through, his tone subtly shifted. "It is easy to destroy," he said with a knowing smile, "and far harder to build. Those of us who have spent decades serving our people understand this well. Let us not be seduced by fiery words and uniforms. Real change requires experience, not theatrics." A ripple ran through the audience. Cameras zoomed in on Traoré, who remained impassive. Though Tinubu never mentioned him by name, everyone knew exactly whom he was targeting. The veiled jabs, the caution against immature revolutionaries, and the emphasis on constitutional traditions all pointed in one direction. Tinubu ended with a flourish. "Africa's future will not be written by children playing at power, but by elders who understand the weight of history." Thunderous applause followed. Most of it came from longtime allies and older delegates. But not everyone clapped. In the sea of ovation, Traoré stood up quietly. Gasps rippled through the hall. It was not his turn to speak. The master of ceremonies looked confused. Security twitched. Tinubu's face hardened slightly. But Traoré walked toward the podium with the calm resolve of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to say. A storm had gathered, and it was about to break. The spotlight followed Captain Ibrahim Traoré as he approached the podium, his boots echoing sharply across the polished marble floor. He was an uninvited speaker in a room defined by protocol, age, and hierarchy. Delegates glanced nervously at each other. Security officers shifted uneasily. The event moderator whispered urgently into a headset, yet no one moved to stop him. President Bola Tinubu narrowed his eyes, his hands clasped tightly together as if containing the storm rising inside him. This wasn't just a break in order, it was a challenge. And in politics, challenges must be crushed or co-opted. But Traoré didn't rush. He stood before the mic with the quiet confidence of a soldier who had survived worse than criticism. He scanned the hall calmly, then adjusted the microphone. "I was not scheduled to speak," he began, his voice measured, his tone respectful. "But I believe that truth does not wait for permission." A sharp hush fell over the room. "I have just listened to our respected elder, President Tinubu," he continued. "He spoke of wisdom, of experience, and of the burdens of leadership. I agree that these are important things. But I ask, what has all that experience brought us?" He let the question hang. No one answered. Traoré's voice grew stronger, more focused. "Today, across Africa, children are dying of hunger. Our youth flee on boats into the sea. Millions are jobless. Families are broken. Nations are in debt. If this is what experience has brought us, then perhaps it is time for a different kind of leadership." Gasps echoed through the hall. Cameras clicked furiously. Some aides whispered into phones. The world was watching this moment. But just as quickly as Traoré had taken the room, Tinubu reclaimed it. The Nigerian president rose slowly from his seat, ignoring the standard procedure, and walked toward the backup microphone position stage right. He was met with cautious glances from his security detail, who seemed unsure whether to follow. Tinubu simply waved them off. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but carried the weight of thunder. "I am not here to entertain lectures from schoolboys who mistake rebellion for revolution," Tinubu said, staring directly at Traoré. "Let me remind you all, I fought for democracy when some of these so-called saviors were still in diapers. I have been imprisoned, exiled, hunted. I did not seize power at gunpoint. I earned it at the ballot box." A wave of applause rippled through his delegation and allied nations. "We must not confuse noise with vision," he continued. "Leadership is not a viral video. It is not a trending hashtag. It is the sleepless night of compromise, of strategy, of burden. We who built this continent from the ashes of colonialism know the cost of freedom." The speech had fire, legacy, and authority. Tinubu was no stranger to confrontation, and he wielded language like a seasoned general wielded a sword. Yet his words were not just directed at Traoré, they were aimed at the entire room, especially the younger delegates who had quietly begun to admire the Burkinabe soldier. He pressed on, his voice rising, "Yes, we made mistakes. Yes, corruption has eaten into our nations. But do not forget, we survived. We preserved the fabric of our states while others were tearing theirs apart with coups, rebellions, and slogans. Experience is not a failure, it is a foundation." The applause was louder now. Some leaders stood in support, mostly those from older regimes. But it was not unanimous. Tinubu, sensing the tide, decided to deliver his final blow. "And let me say this clearly," he said. "We will not allow Africa to be dragged backward by those who reject our institutions. We will not watch our children become pawns in someone's military fantasy. Order matters, law matters, and legacy matters." He raised his fist. Africa must rise, but it must rise with wisdom, not chaos. With that, he returned to his seat, dignified and defiant. Captain Traoré had not moved during the rebuttal. His expression remained unreadable, but something about his stillness made it clear he was not intimidated. The hall was now divided, not just by age or rank, but by vision. The lines had been drawn, and the summit had turned into a silent battleground. Two titans had spoken. One represented the past, the other, the possibility of the future. The true summit had begun. The air was electric. Delegates were frozen in place, caught between the weight of legacy and the spark of revolution. President Bola Tinubu's words still echoed in the chamber, laced with authority, hardened by decades of power. But across the podium, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood unmoved. Then, slowly, he stepped forward once again. No one dared interrupt this unfolding duel. Not the moderators. Not the aides. Not even the security officials stationed near the exits. Every eye was locked on the young Burkinabe president. Every camera was fixed. Social media live streams were peaking, millions of Africans watching, tweeting, recording. Traoré adjusted the mic again, his expression thoughtful, almost calm. But behind his eyes burned the controlled fury of a man who had seen too much, lost too much, to remain silent. With all due respect, President Tinubu, he began, you say you earned your position at the ballot box. But what good is a ballot if it leads to the same broken promises? If the votes only crown new kings who serve old masters? A tremor passed through the room. You speak of democracy, he continued. But what we have in many parts of Africa is not democracy. It is dynasty. It is deception. It is deals signed in foreign boardrooms while our people go to bed hungry. Murmurs filled the space. Traoré had thrown off all diplomatic filters. He was not playing by the summit script. He was rewriting it. I did not seize power for glory, he said, his voice steady. I took up arms because our people were dying in the streets. Because terrorists were beheading our villagers while the international community sent us thoughts and prayers. Because your institutions, your experience, had failed us. Now the younger delegates leaned forward, listening. Traoré was no longer defending himself. He was indicting an entire political era. I was a soldier, he continued, but I was also a witness. I saw how our natural resources were shipped overseas while our schools fell apart. I saw how foreign troops were stationed on our soil, not to protect us, but to protect foreign interests. And I decided that if no one would fight for the people, I would. Some in the hall began to nod, slowly, subtly. Others whispered urgently to their aides. Tinubu's face remained stoic, but his fingers tapped rhythmically on his seat, a telltale sign of irritation. Traoré's tone softened, but his words sharpened. We are not children. We are the sons and daughters of Sankara, of Lumumba, of Nkrumah. We do not rebel for rebellion's sake. We rebel because you have left us no other option. A silence fell across the room. For a long moment, no one clapped. The weight of the statement sank in like a stone into still water. Then a single delegate, a young minister from Senegal, slowly began to applaud. Tentatively. Then another from Chad. Then a few from Guinea. Within seconds, part of the hall was filled with soft but sincere applause. It wasn't deafening. It wasn't unanimous. But it was defiant. Traoré remained humble, almost restrained, as he concluded. I am not here to seek validation, he said. I am here to speak the truth, not because it is convenient, but because it is necessary. Africa cannot move forward by walking in circles around old power. If we want a different future, we must take a different path. He nodded toward Tinubu's side of the room. I honor your journey, Mr. President, but we are not walking the same road. Then, with quiet dignity, Traoré stepped down from the podium. No anthem played. No announcement followed. For a while, even the media stood unsure of what to do. But across the room, and across the continent, the mood had shifted. The cameras caught it all. The firmness in his voice. The fire in his eyes. The steadiness of a man who did not speak to impress, but to awaken. And he had. The battle lines were no longer theoretical. Africa was no longer watching a summit. It was witnessing a shift. The silence that followed Captain Traoré's speech was more powerful than any thunderous applause. It was the kind of silence that only truth can command, raw, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. Some leaders shifted in their seats. Others averted their eyes. But no one dared to speak just yet. Not after what had been said. After a few moments, Traoré returned to his seat, nodding to his delegation, most of them young, serious, and visibly moved. The The room resumed its official schedule, but the summit would never be the same again. Behind every speech that followed, every panel discussion, and every roundtable was the unspoken weight of what had transpired on that stage. Later that evening, during a closed-door side session meant for strategic dialogue between Sahel nations, Captain Traoré was given another chance to speak, this time by protocol, not protest. The next morning, the summit hall looked the same, red carpets vacuumed, floral centerpieces refreshed, diplomats seated in neat rows, but the atmosphere had undeniably changed. The aftershocks of Traoré's speeches still rippled beneath the polished surface. Something fundamental had shifted, though no official would yet dare say it aloud. President Bola Tinubu arrived flanked by his traditional entourage, senior aides, military attaches, and loyal ministers. But even they sensed it. Gone was the absolute command he'd wielded the day before. Gone was the air of undisputed authority. Now, his presence drew glances of calculation, not just reverence. Delegates began to murmur, not about Nigeria's oil or ECOWAS policy, but about the Burkina captain, the soldier who had thrown a gauntlet at the feet of Africa's old guard. The man who had dared to say what millions whispered in cafes, buses, and classrooms across the continent. When the day's sessions resumed, the topic was supposed to be economic integration. But even as trade figures and currency projections were presented on LED screens, minds wandered. It was during a discussion on regional youth unemployment that the underlying tremor finally surfaced. A young finance minister from Ghana stood up, deviating from her prepared notes. "It is difficult to talk about employment," she said boldly, "when our political systems do not empower the very youth we want to hire." Gasps, murmurs. She pressed on. "We talk of growth, but whose growth? Whose future?" I believe President Traoré was right. If our institutions are incapable of adapting, then perhaps it is not the youth who are impatient, but the systems that are obsolete. Tinubu leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. Another minister, this time from Uganda, raised his hand. Africa's future belongs to those who dare to imagine a different reality. We must stop equating age with wisdom and military pasts with illegitimacy. Traoré represents a generation that's tired of waiting. And just like that, the room began to fracture, not into chaos, but into clarity. The old lines of power, long preserved by courtesy and tradition, had begun to crack. Younger delegates started speaking more freely. Even some older ministers began using phrases like inclusive transition, intergenerational dialogue, and reform before revolt. For Tinubu, this was more than political theater. It was an existential threat. The summit, once a stage for him to reinforce Nigeria's dominance, had morphed into a referendum on his legacy. He requested a private break. Inside the green room, away from the cameras, Tinubu slammed a folder onto the table. "They're buying into this fantasy," he growled at his aides. "Do you hear them? Applauding military coups like they're liberation songs. They're forgetting what happens when boys with guns run countries." His national security advisor tried to soothe him. "It's just talk, sir. The younger ministers don't hold the levers of power." Tinubu shot him a hard look. "Talk is where it begins. Revolutions don't need permission, they need a spark." And Traoré just lit a fire under every disillusioned youth on this continent. Meanwhile, out in the main hall, journalists swarmed younger delegates. Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag Traoré Wave, hashtag Africa Wakens, hashtag Youth Rising. Clips of Traoré's speech were translated into French, Swahili, Hausa, and Arabic. Students in Nairobi shared them on projectors in classrooms. Taxi drivers in Kinshasa played the audio like a sermon. Radio hosts in Bamako replayed his words every hour. The streets may have been distant from the marble walls of the summit, but the pulse was unmistakable. Something had broken loose. A revolution of perception. A generational earthquake. And for the first time in decades, Africa's youth, so often sidelined and spoken for, felt seen. Not by celebrities or foreign aid organizations, but by one of their own. That evening, an impromptu youth gathering formed in a hotel lobby adjacent to the conference center. Young diplomats, journalists, activists, all drawn together by a sense of shared urgency. One woman, a legal advisor from Kenya, said it best. We were raised on the idea that change takes time. But what if that was the lie? What if change takes courage instead? The group nodded. Someone raised their glass and toasted, to Traoré, and to the Africa we must dare to imagine. Back in his suite, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly by the window, overlooking the Abuja skyline. He wasn't celebrating. He knew what came next. Praise would turn to pressure, admiration to attacks. And behind the applause lurked dangerous enemies, powerful ones. But in that moment, for the first time since he took power, he felt he wasn't alone. Africa was listening, and the earth was moving. While the summit continued in the grand halls under the eyes of the media, the real drama had slipped behind velvet curtains and into private suites, guarded corridors, and late-night strategy sessions. The official sessions were a facade now. The real power games had begun. President Bola Tinubu's inner circle convened inside the Nigerian delegation's high-security suite at the Transcorp Hilton. The mood was tense. His chief of staff, foreign minister, national security advisor, and economic strategist sat around a polished mahogany table strewn with intelligence memos and press briefings. The foreign minister spoke first. Traoré's speech has gone viral in over 30 countries. His name is trending in South Africa, Kenya, Senegal, even in our own Lagos. He has become a symbol, not of Burkina Faso, but of a generational shift. Tinubu's face was stone. He had heard it all already. But now it was official. The political tremor was not limited to the summit. It was global, and it was real. Do we counter him? The security advisor asked. Discredit him publicly? Leak something about his alliances with Russia or Iran? Tinubu shook his head. Not yet. If we strike now, we'll make him a martyr. We need to outmaneuver him. Quietly. There was a long silence before he added, set up a discreet ECOWAS session. Not here. In Accra or Abidjan. I want our old allies in one room. No media. No youth ministers. Just the heads of state. We must contain this wave before it sweeps across the entire bloc. They all nodded. This was no longer about Burkina Faso. It was about narrative control, about reasserting the established order. Meanwhile, just a few floors below, a different kind of meeting was taking place. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat with his close confidants, mostly young, sharp-minded aides, former student leaders, and loyal military advisors. There was no grandeur in their war room, no golden chandeliers, just laptops, notepads, and passion. A Burkinabe communications strategist spoke quickly. Sir, your speech has been clipped, subtitled, and shared in over 40 languages. Even diaspora communities in France and Canada are calling it a turning point. Another advisor added, you've received informal messages of support from Guinea, Mali, and parts of the Central African Republic. Some have asked if you're planning a Pan-African coalition. Traoré didn't smile. He wasn't fooled by praise. This is bigger than me, he said. But if they're looking for direction, we must provide it, not as a military bloc, but as a movement. One that stands for sovereignty, dignity, and justice. He paused. Reach out to Mali and Guinea. Quietly. We must begin discussions on mutual trade, security collaboration, and currency independence. If we can show Africa what unity looks like without neo-colonial interference, we'll do more than win speeches. We'll change history. The room nodded. A young lawyer from the delegation leaned forward. Sir, some of the ECOWAS heads are now afraid you might be planning to break away. That's why Nigeria is scrambling to rally them. They fear you're building something new. Traoré looked out the window. Let them fear, but let them also think. For once, let Africa's old leaders reflect on the damage they've done. By midnight, secret conversations were taking place all across the summit hotel. Delegations from South Sudan, Zimbabwe, Sierra Leone, and Gambia sent junior envoys to feel out Traoré's stance. Would he support debt renegotiation blocs? Was he open to new regional security architecture outside of Western Command? Would he back a youth-led Continental Assembly? It wasn't formal diplomacy, but it was real. Back in the Nigerian suite, Tinubu received an emergency call from the president of Côte d'Ivoire. Bola, what are you planning? The Ivorian leader asked. Keeping the continent from burning, Tinubu replied coldly. Traoré is starting a wildfire. I won't let it spread. Well, then you'd better act fast, the voice warned. Because some of your allies? They're starting to believe in the fire. Tinubu ended the call. His face turned to granite. What had begun as a summit had turned into a chessboard. And he was no longer the only player moving the pieces. Behind the polite speeches and photo ops, the tectonic plates of African power were shifting. Old empires were trembling. New alliances were forming. And in the quiet corners of hotel hallways and encrypted group chats, the map of Africa was slowly, but unmistakably, being redrawn. While the summit's official proceedings entered their third day with sessions on climate, investment, and security, the true headlines were no longer written within the walls of Abuja's marble conference halls. They were being written across the streets, screens, and souls of the African people. In a modest cafe in Dakar, a group of university students sat huddled around a single laptop, the Wi-Fi signal flickering as they replayed Captain Ibrahim Traoré's now famous speech. Rewind that part, one student urged, his eyes wide. The screen flickered. We are not children. We are the sons and daughters of Sankara. Right there, someone whispered. The group fell silent. They didn't speak after it ended. No one needed to. In that moment, a fire had been lit in their eyes. The message wasn't just about Burkina Faso, it was about them. Their frustrations. Their stolen futures. Their quiet fury. The same was happening in Nairobi, where Uber drivers streamed the clip between rides. In Addis Ababa, where journalists debated it on underground podcasts. In Johannesburg, where young professionals began hosting impromptu Traoré talks in community centers and pubs. On radio stations in Bamako, DJs were calling it the most honest speech by an African president in a generation. Social media influencers across the continent shared their favorite lines, using hashtags like #TraoréTruth, #TheRealSummit, and #AfricanSpring. In one viral video, a schoolteacher in Ouagadougou paused her lesson to play Traoré's speech. As the children listened in silence, the teacher wiped away tears. "We finally have a voice," she whispered. But it wasn't just the youth who were stirred. In royal courts and state palaces, elder leaders watched with concern. Some felt a growing unease, not just about Traoré, but about what he represented. A new political awakening, spreading not from Paris or Washington, but from within Africa itself. In Yaoundé, President Biya's chief of staff delivered an urgent intelligence report. "Sir, there have been spikes in youth mobilizations since the summit began. Online chatter is growing around Traoré. Some are calling for a Burkina Faso model to be applied here." The Cameroonian leader nodded solemnly. "Keep a close eye on universities. Shut down any meetings disguised as civic forums." In Cairo, the Egyptian intelligence service compiled a 16-page internal memo on Traoré's growing influence, suggesting that Pan-African solidarity narratives may be used to justify internal dissent. In South Africa, the reaction was more mixed. While the ruling ANC saw him as a disruptor, younger factions within the party quietly applauded him. A youth leader even tweeted, "Africa's future has a name. And it's not a committee. It's courage. #TraoréWave." Even in Lagos, President Tinubu's stronghold, something was stirring. At the University of Lagos, students organized a roundtable discussion titled, "Revolution or Recklessness? The Traoré Doctrine." Hundreds showed up, and while some criticized his military background, the room erupted with applause every time his name was mentioned. The Nigerian presidency responded swiftly. State-sponsored media began running stories questioning Traoré's economic policies. They dug up old footage of instability in Burkina Faso, painting it as evidence of his incompetence. Editorials referred to him as a populist messiah leading a nation into uncertainty. But the more they tried to smear him, the more relatable he became. For many Africans, especially those under 35, who make up more than half the continent, Traoré wasn't just a president. He was a mirror, reflecting their anger, their questions, their hope. Back in Abuja, Tinubu was briefed on the growing digital storm. "The narrative is slipping, sir," his media advisor admitted. "Every attempt to paint him as reckless is being flipped into proof of his authenticity." Tinubu sighed deeply, tapping his cane against the marble floor. "He is young," he muttered. "He will make mistakes. They always do." But deep down, he knew this was no ordinary flame. This was wildfire, and it was leaping over borders. In the quiet halls of Ghana's presidential palace, an advisor put it plainly to her president: "We've entered a new moment, sir. One where legitimacy is no longer defined by title, but by truth." And so, from dusty cafes in Bamako to the glass towers of Nairobi, from dorm rooms to state palaces, Africa found itself gripped by a question no summit agenda had planned for. What if the age of the elders had finally ended? In every summit, there comes a moment when the official speeches lose their meaning and the real negotiations begin, in whispers, in corridors, in phone calls placed behind closed doors. The Abuja summit had reached that moment. And this time, the realignment was happening fast and out of sight. President Bola Tinubu had sensed the change. He'd seen it in the eyes of once loyal allies who now offered only formal nods. He saw it in the younger presidents, those who had once waited eagerly for his advice, now retreating into discreet sidebar meetings that didn't include Nigeria's representatives. In response, Tinubu moved quickly. Within hours of the last plenary session, his delegation secured a separate venue, a private conference room at the Nigerian Defense House. Invitations went out only to select heads of state, those known to be allies, or at least reliable pragmatists. The session was to discuss security realignment in West Africa, but the real goal was clear: contain Traoré's influence before it fractured the regional balance. On the guest list, the presidents of Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Togo, and Benin. Cameroon was invited in observer capacity. None of the Sahel nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, were included. As Tinubu prepared for the meeting, his foreign minister cautioned him, "We're playing a dangerous game. If we harden too fast, it will look like we're afraid." That gives Traoré even more power. Tinubu looked up from the briefing notes. "This isn't fear. It's control. If you let a forest fire spread too far, it stops being a problem. It becomes the new landscape." But while Tinubu plotted with old allies, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was having a different kind of conversation, one that didn't need chandeliers or military guards. His meetings were digital, quiet, swift. He connected via secure line to Colonel Assimi Goïta of Mali, then another to Mamadi Doumbouya, of Guinea, then a third to a rising youth minister in South Sudan. The topic was clear: cooperation beyond the confines of the old bloc. "We need to think beyond ECOWAS," Traoré said bluntly. "It has become a tool for preserving old interests. But what if we built something new, a coalition of African nations that prioritize sovereignty, not submission?" Goïta responded first. "We've already begun discussing shared currency alternatives. We're tired of the CFA franc. It chains us to colonial control." Doumbouya added, "If we align militarily and economically, even symbolically, the West will panic. But more importantly, the youth of Africa will finally believe change is possible." Traoré nodded. "We don't need grand declarations. Just coordinated steps. Shared trade routes. Mutual defense agreements. Joint agricultural zones. Let them mock us. Let them isolate us. But they will not stop us." Word began to leak. A diplomatic aide from South Africa quietly signaled interest. "Our government won't endorse anything openly," she messaged Traoré's team, "but our youth wing is fully aligned with your direction." In Chad, a reform-minded prime minister requested a private audience with the Burkinabe delegation. "What you said at the summit, that leadership is service, not spectacle," it resonated. "Tell us what comes next. We want to be ready." Even in Kenya, where the official government remained cautious, a prominent senator declared on national television, "If President Traoré is guilty of anything, it is reminding Africans of our worth. And that is no crime." Back in Abuja, Tinubu received a troubling update. Several nations had declined to join his private session. Côte d'Ivoire was hesitant. Senegal sent a deputy instead of the president. Benin requested more time. Loyalty was fracturing, not in a storm, but in a slow, quiet drift. "They smell change," Tinubu muttered, pacing his suite. "Even the ones who won't admit it. They're watching which way the wind blows." His advisor sighed. "Sir, what if the wind isn't blowing anymore? What if it's already turned?" Tinubu stopped, staring out the window at the Abuja skyline. And far below, unknown to him, a small group of youth delegates from various nations was gathered in a modest hotel restaurant, discussing the idea of forming a Continental Youth Congress. Inspired by Traoré. Not under any government. Not seeking permission. Just committed to change. And across the continent, from the mountains of Rwanda to the beaches of Sierra Leone, something subtle yet powerful was happening. Lines were being redrawn. Not by force. Not by coups. But by the courage to imagine something new. The final plenary session of the Abuja summit was meant to be ceremonial, a concluding affair, with polished speeches, group photos, and mutual affirmations. But everyone present knew the ceremony was a mask, barely holding back the rift now tearing through the continent's political soul. Inside the massive conference hall, floral arrangements adorned the stage. The flags of 23 nations fluttered behind the long table where heads of states sat shoulder to shoulder. President Tinubu, dressed in a pristine agbada of white and gold, sat at the center like a reigning monarch. But today, his composure felt different, not regal, but rigid. His eyes occasionally drifted across the hall to where Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat, calm, surrounded by younger ministers and military advisors. The young president had remained quiet since his explosive interventions earlier in the week. But his silence was not surrender, it was strategy. As the moderator welcomed dignitaries and introduced the closing remarks, the atmosphere was brittle. Everyone waited for the inevitable moment when the polite mask would shatter again, and it came sooner than expected. Burkina Faso was scheduled to present a brief on regional agricultural cooperation, a standard item ignored by most summits in the past. But when Traoré rose from his seat to deliver the address himself, the room stiffened. He approached the podium slowly, adjusted the mic, and began in his usual calm tone. "Today I speak not only as president of Burkina Faso, but as a servant of African truth. What we plant today will grow into the Africa our children inherit. But if the soil is poisoned, with debt, with corruption, with betrayal, nothing will grow." A few in the crowd stirred uncomfortably. Tinubu's jaw clenched. Traoré continued, "We cannot pretend unity while silencing those who question power. We cannot build a future on the backs of the same old policies that failed the past. Africa is at a crossroads. One path leads to submission, the other to sovereignty." The hall was still. Even the translators paused momentarily, weighing the weight of his words. Suddenly, a movement broke the silence. A delegation, small but symbolic, rose to its feet. The junior ministers of Guinea, then a few from Mali, then a young delegate from the Gambia. In silent respect, they stood as Traoré spoke. It was a simple gesture, but it broke protocol. And it broke the summit. Gasps spread like wildfire. The cameras caught it. The world saw it live. These were not just officials paying respect. These were leaders in the making, openly defying the pecking order. Tinubu could not let it pass. He stood abruptly, whispered something to his aide, and signaled to his entire delegation. Like clockwork, Nigeria's representatives stood and began to exit the hall in a coordinated walkout. The room erupted in murmurs. Shock turned into symbolic fracture. President Tinubu didn't look back as he walked out. But he had sent the message loud and clear. Lines had been drawn. Nigeria, and those who followed its lead, would no longer entertain what they now branded the Traoré agenda. But others did not follow. Côte d'Ivoire stayed seated. Senegal's youth minister whispered fiercely into his mic to cancel his flight. Even Rwanda's quiet, measured representatives didn't move. On the podium, Traoré did not raise his voice. He didn't respond to the walkout with anger or retaliation. He simply lowered his gaze and finished his remarks. Africa is not a title to be inherited. It is a promise to be fulfilled. And the time to fulfill it is not in decades, but in our lifetimes. He stepped down. The room did not erupt. It vibrated, quietly, powerfully, with something deeper than applause, alignment. The kind that doesn't come from protocol, but from conviction. Behind the scenes, messages flooded between capitals. New blocs were being quietly imagined. Military cooperation talks began among Sahel nations. Rumors swirled of a future summit, not led by ECOWAS or the AU, but by the youth. Traoré returned to his seat and sipped water calmly. He had not come to divide Africa, but to awaken it. And in doing so, he had forced the continent to choose. Old order or new vision. That day, two Africas emerged on the floor of the same summit. One clung to the past, polished, powerful, but increasingly hollow. The other stepped forward, untested, defiant, and undeniably alive. The curtain was falling on unity by force. Rising in its place was something harder to control, but far more real. Unity by conviction. The summit was over, at least on paper. Delegations packed their briefcases. Security personnel secured the exits. Media correspondents filed their final reports. But deep within the consciousness of a continent, something far more enduring had just begun. The group photo taken at the end of the Abuja summit looked like every other in the African Union archives. Smiling presidents, stiff handshakes, colorful traditional robes, and diplomatic masks. But the cracks beneath that frame could not be edited out. President Bola Tinubu boarded his armored convoy in silence. He had played his part, made his walkout, reaffirmed Nigeria's dominance. But inside, he felt it, a sensation that no title could shake, the uneasy awareness that power had shifted beneath his feet. He was still president, still respected, but for the first time, he was no longer the center of Africa's political gravity. In the days following the summit, African newspapers ran conflicting headlines. Tinubu holds line on continental stability, read the cover of a Lagos daily. The birth of a new Africa ran in bold print on a Senegalese paper. Burkina Faso's Traoré sparks Pan-African awakening, shouted a headline from Ghana. Rebel or reformer? The world reacts to Traoré, posed a cautious editorial in London. But beyond the headlines, something more visceral was unfolding. In Accra, hundreds of students marched peacefully, waving signs that read, "We are not too young to lead," and "Africa is ours too." In Bamako, a group of youth leaders formed the Sankara Circle, an unofficial alliance of activists and young lawmakers pushing for political reforms inspired by Traoré's ideals. In Nairobi, a popular podcast titled The Reckoning shot to #1, featuring daily discussions on post-summit realignment and the role of youth in politics. Even in Lagos, Tinubu's stronghold, dissent found oxygen. Though muted, whispers of "Traoré is right" echoed in university halls, market corners, and online forums. The old guard had weathered storms before, but never one that spread from phone screens to voting booths. In Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré returned not to celebration, but to work. There were no grand parades, no declarations of victory. He resumed cabinet meetings, reviewed agricultural plans, and convened a gathering of village leaders from conflict zones. His advisors urged him to capitalize on the momentum. "Strike while the world listens," they said. But Traoré was cautious. "Movements built on emotion collapse like waves," he said. "We must build roots, not ripples." Behind closed doors, he initiated talks with Guinea and Mali about forming a sovereign Sahel alliance, not merely for military cooperation, but for shared education programs, food independence, and infrastructure development. It was not about opposition to ECOWAS or the AU, but the creation of an alternative that answered to the people, not former colonial puppeteers. Meanwhile, in Brussels and Paris, Western think tanks held emergency briefings. Traoré was labeled a destabilizing influence, a wild card, a symbol of anti-West populism. But none of their definitions captured the truth. He wasn't just challenging policy. He was challenging an entire paradigm. No longer would African leadership be judged by how well it followed Western recommendations. No longer would stability mean silence in the face of suffering. No longer would youth be relegated to slogans and social media campaigns. The age of reckoning had begun. And it wasn't just about politics. It was about power. Who owned it? Who earned it? And who had the right to reshape it? In the months that followed, a wave of elections, protests, and policy reforms spread across Africa. Some regimes clamped down harder, fearing the Traoré effect. Others cautiously opened doors to younger voices, hoping to adapt before being swept away. Africa was no longer waiting. It was no longer asking for permission. It was deciding, in real time, what kind of continent it wanted to be. And though the road ahead was fraught with danger, betrayal, and resistance, one truth had become unshakable. The conversation had changed. And in that change, a soldier from Burkina Faso had done what generations of speeches and summits had failed to do. He had sparked a reckoning. Not with weapons, but with words, will, and an unshakable belief that Africa could rise, not as a divided continent, but as a united force. One not defined by its past, but by the courage of those bold enough to demand a future.